I've never told this story for a lot of reasons. 1, it brings up a lot of bad memories for me, obviously. 2, it paints my family in an ugly light that I don't want to think about. And 3, it's gonna sound like I'm lying, or that I was hallucinating or dreaming or something like that. So, right off the bat, let me say, you can think what you want of me and my family, but I am not a liar and I am not a crazy person. What I'm about to tell you actually happened. I just don't know what it was that happened. So this story takes place throughout the week after my mother died. She passed from lung cancer, she was a lifelong smoker, and we knew it was coming for a while. In a way, we got to do our grieving in advance. It was pretty awful. It seemed like in some ways my mother and my father grew apart as it happened. I overheard a lot of conversations between them that sounded like arguments, where she would beg him to bury her over and over, and he would kind of nod and try to avoid responding by saying that it would be difficult or that he just couldn't do it. I didn't understand why, and they never had this conversation in front of me or my sister. My father barely saw her when she was on her deathbed. She cried constantly, and it was hard to talk to her about anything. I guess I just didn't know what to say. One of the last conversations we had, she took my hand and squeezed it and stared at me with her hollow black eyes and made me promise I would watch her be buried. She made me promise it would be an open casket and that I would watch her be lowered into the ground. I didn't know what to say, but I said that I would, of course. When she died later that day, the doctors took her body away before I really had a chance to say goodbye. I broke my promise. Her burial was scheduled without me being in the conversation since I was just a kid at the time, and my father kept me and my sister from going to the funeral. It all just happened around us without us having any say in it. My dad didn't do much to comfort me and my sister after she died. We just had each other. If someone would mention the fact that she died over dinner, he would just act as if he didn't hear us, change the subject, or just go quiet. There was no conversation. I had trouble sleeping a couple nights after she was gone. I would lie with my eyes open, watching the stairs through the blinds of my window, and think about her. This is what I was doing when I first heard our back door open. I peeked out my bedroom window, which had a great view of the backyard, and I saw my dad had walked out onto the back porch and was heading further into our backyard. I got out of bed and ran to the back door to see where he was going, and saw his figure leaving our property to wander out into the forest behind our house. I ran out to follow him, trying to keep my distance so he didn't notice me, and I watched him meet with someone out in the trees. That someone looked like a woman, wearing some kind of hat, but I was too scared to get any closer and try to make out who she was. They talked for around 5 minutes, and that's when I got too nervous and ran back to the house and tried to fall asleep. I think if I was older, I would have assumed he was cheating and that was why he was so dismissive of my mom as her health went downhill, but I was too young and innocent for that to even cross my mind. I guess I was just confused about why he was being so secretive about this conversation that he had to go out so late at night. My sister was a year older than me, so she thought he was cheating right away when I told her about it the next morning. She didn't explain all that to me, but she devised a plan for us to go out the next night and see what was going on. That day, before we carried out the plan, I studied my father as he ate his meals. I tried to look into his eyes to see if they had tears in them. I tried watching the wrinkles in his face to see if they would reveal some kind of emotion. They didn't. Even though it was just 2 days after his wife died, he acted like it was just a regular Tuesday. He snuck out the back door again that night. I ran across the hall to wake my sister, who was already waiting with her jacket on, ready to go out. We both tiptoed out onto the back porch and followed him as he went out into the forest. This time, it didn't seem like he knew exactly where to meet this woman. It took him a few minutes before he found her, standing at another tree a bit further out. We couldn't really see either of them at all, and we couldn't hear them speaking, so we hopped the fence and walked as quietly as we could, hoping the crickets would muffle the sounds of leaves crunching underneath our footsteps. We got closer and closer till we eventually found a tree big enough to hide us and close enough that we could hear their voices. We couldn't really hear the words they said, but my father sounded sad. It was hard to place what this woman sounded like. The best word I could use to describe it would probably be confused, but sometimes she sounded scared, sometimes angry. It was hard to place. My sister and I whispered to each other that it was probably time we ran back to the house, before our father got back and discovered that we weren't home. We were about to turn around and run back to the house when we heard a familiar word escape this mysterious woman's lips. "Dear?" It wasn't just the word, it was the way that she said it. I heard my father choke back tears out of surprise. The way this woman said "dear," a word my mother called my father countless times, sounded exactly like my mom. Down to the syllable. Chills ran down my spine. My sister and I ran back to the house and we went right to sleep, barely discussing what we'd just seen and heard. I can only assume my sister heard the resemblance like I did, but Mom was dead and there was no point in trying to say this woman reminded us of her. It would just make the whole situation hurt more. My sister convinced me the next morning, when my father was still off at work, that we should confront her that night, and him too if necessary. It wasn't right that he should move on this fast, especially if he'd already been talking to this woman while he was still with our mother, so the plan was that we'd sneak out before our dad left the house and try to find her in the woods. If he showed up, then we'd ask him face to face, but our number one priority was to figure out what was going on with this lady. So that night, we went through with the plan. Right when my dad went off to his room, my sister and I met up and started creeping out of the house. But then, we heard rustling in the backyard. We cursed ourselves as we realized that the sound of him going to bed might have actually been the sound of him going out. But when we looked out the window, the person in the back didn't look like him. It was a woman with a top hat. I looked at my sister nervously to see what she was going to do, but she was already opening the back door and walking out to confront the woman. "Hey!" she called. "Who are you?" "Not now, baby," the woman responded. It was as if I was hearing my own mother respond to her. It was like some lady was talking through my mother's vocal cords. She always called us baby. My sister gasped and ran back into the house. I asked her what happened, and all she managed to say was, That's Mom." I opened the door immediately and ran out to see if it was true, and by some miracle our mother had come back from the dead. I saw right away that this wasn't the case. The woman in our backyard almost had my mother's face. She had her chin, and she had her nose, cheeks, her smile. But she didn't have her eyes, which were a swirl of colors all piled together to create massive black irises. Her neck was fat, folding over and into itself, and yet she looked so much skinnier than usual. This was not my mother. "Night, night," she said, like my mother always said at bedtime. I screamed and ran back into the house as I heard the woman's footsteps slowly stumbling towards me. My father ran out of his room and saw me and my sister cowering inside, and he pushed past us and out the door to face her. "Stop! Stop!" he called. "This is too far!" I watched from inside as the woman continued towards him. "I should have let you go!" he cried. "I should have buried you, I'm sorry." She kept walking casually towards him, till he ran out and took her hands in his own. I watched in horror, I couldn't look away. Slowly, he lifted her arms with his own and started to dance. Together, my father and this person slow danced in our backyard, her following his footsteps with her own out of pure muscle memory. "Go inside!" I heard him yell. "Go to sleep!" I didn't want to. I wanted to make sure he'd be all right. But my sister grabbed my arm and pulled me to my room as I struggled to keep watching, and eventually she managed to drag me all the way back to her bedroom. We both slept in the same bed that night, as I tried with all my might not to think about whatever happened. We called to declare my father missing the next day. He never came home again. Luckily, my sister and I weren't separated. We ended up moving in with some relatives and grew into functional adults. I've been able to keep my life together even though I have nightmares most nights. In my nightmares, I watch this woman and my father dance all night. And when they finish in the morning, they come back home, and me, my sister, my father, and my mother all eat breakfast together just like any other morning. I'm a bad person. If you don't feel like hearing this whole story, that's the TLDR. But obviously there's more to it than that. The only reason I know I'm a bad person, I guess the only reason that thought got knocked into my head is because of something I can't explain. My family is well off, but we aren't rich. We can afford to live comfortably. But there are some things that I've never been able to get. I wanted a motorcycle. I know, I'm a spoiled jerk. We'll get to that. My grandfather was a sort of superstitious man. He left plenty behind for us, but he also believed that there were some things he didn't have to leave behind. Specifically his watch and some of my grandmother's jewelry. When he was near the end, he told my parents through his raspy, quaking voice that he would return it to her when he passed, if it was buried with him. I liked the man, of course. He was my grandfather, but he and I didn't always see eye to eye. And I definitely didn't believe in an afterlife, not like he was describing where you could just take whatever you wanted from this life and bring it with you. I thought that was the point of life, right? Spend what you can while you're here because those things you earn on Earth aren't going with you. And I wanted a motorcycle to drive on these streets, down here, not in heaven or wherever. So, I thought the best solution to all our problems would be for him to be buried just as he was supposed to be, with all his luxuries in the coffin with him, and that'd leave my family to grieve a little easier while I paid his grave a visit and claimed my inheritance without anyone's feelings having to get hurt. The graveyard in front of the old church was always horrible to look at. Gravestones stuck out of the ground here and there like they were never planned out. It was almost like nobody ever expected anyone in this town to die, so they just threw down a new rock wherever someone did and called it a day until it happened the next time. My grandfather's grave was near the main path towards the church entrance. They were clearly running out of room. I felt like I was being watched as I entered the graveyard with my shovel and walked towards where his coffin laid, the ground still fresh above it. I figured it was because of the crows perched on the church roof that I felt that way, but I guess feelings can be funny that way. That feeling got stronger when my shovel first dug into the dirt. I guess I was just feeling guilty at that point, even though I didn't think I had any reason to. I just kept digging, constantly fighting the urge to look over my shoulder or off into the forest behind the church, wherever someone must have been watching me from. After half an hour, I'd already dug a good third of the way down. I was getting exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stop. If I did, I'd be caught in the morning. This job had to be done all in one night, or I'd be both poor and in jail. I thought about how disappointed my family would be if they knew what I was doing. Especially my grandfather. This feeling of being watched was really eating at me, making me feel like I was at my own trial, being judged by everyone that loved me. Maybe I even felt like I was digging my own grave. I kept digging for another 45 minutes, nearly making it to the bottom, when suddenly I jumped. I could have sworn I heard someone clear their throat. Not just someone, but my grandfather. I'd heard that throat clear countless times when he was alive. It came from somewhere inside the church. I was hearing things, I realized. I was so on edge and tired that I was starting to hallucinate. Finally, after another half hour, I felt my shovel hit wood. I sighed and laughed out of relief and tossed my shovel out of the grave. I was so excited and ready to get out of there that I didn't notice my shovel didn't make a sound when it landed. I kneeled down in the dirt and fumbled around with the coffin lid, trying to avoid getting splinters, and managed to pry it open. The jewels were in there, as was the watch, but my grandfather wasn't. I gasped out loud. Why was the coffin empty? I tried to think through all the possible reasons as I grabbed the valuables, but nothing made sense. I stuffed my pockets and looked back up to get out of the hole, only to find a pair of old eyes staring back at me. My grandfather, wearing a top hat, cleared his throat. At least it was a man that looked like him, and certainly had around half his face, but the other half looked like it might have been stolen off a middle-aged woman, and his scalp looked so cobbled together like a Frankenstein creation made from 100 different heads. I could smell the embalming fluid in his sweat as his drool pooled up in his mouth, ready to pour out into the hole I dug myself into. I screamed and cried and threw out all the jewelry out of my pockets. I showed him the palms of my hands to show him that I wasn't carrying anything. I begged him to forgive me. I trembled as I watched his jigsaw face shift into a look of sleepiness, and he leaned into the hole further and further until I realized he was falling in. I leaped out of the hole as he toppled into the open coffin, nearly making contact with him but managing to just barely jerk my leg out of the way in time. I ran straight out of the graveyard, not bothering to grab my shovel or refill the hole. I turned around after I'd reached a safe distance and saw that he wasn't trying to climb out of the hole. He must have been too old, or maybe the way his body was shaped, he was stuck in there for good. The next morning, I kept waiting to hear about the grave robbing and how they found his corpse all mutilated. I kept waiting for them to confront me about the missing shovel and how it was found at the graveyard. But none of that happened. When I visited the grave, it was perfectly covered with dirt again, as if last night had never happened. I was relieved when I realized that it must have been a dream until I noticed my shovel leaned against the church wall, left behind by someone so it could be returned to its rightful owner. I don't typically like to insert myself into my stories. I prefer to keep a distance from my subject matter to maintain a sense of objectivity. But in this case, I believe my own experience and influence is an integral part of the story at hand. My name is Sharon Cohn, and I recently investigated the rumored presence of a cult in a small town called True. I first heard of this cult through reports of a missing child in True. The child's family blamed the cult for their child's disappearance, and I had no information available to confirm or deny this. From what I could tell, this was the first time that the cult had been mentioned anywhere outside of True. I was interested in writing a piece just to have my name on the cult's debut, but after a few phone calls, the only information I was able to gather was that the cult called themselves the Ones Left Behind, and that they worshipped a man called the Mayor. The Mayor wasn't their leader, nor was he actually the Mayor of True, but from what I could tell, he was a real person. None of this made any sense to me at all, so I came to the conclusion that the only way I'd be able to complete this piece and have it contain real, verifiable, intelligible information would be for me to pay the town a visit. I traveled with just an audio recorder and my partner. I had arranged a meetup with the truetown citizen that had supplied me with most of the information. A high school girl with a cat she was very eager to show me the moment I knocked on her door. After she was satisfied with the amount I'd seen her cat, she told me quite excitedly about how she'd watched the cult as it'd grown in this town over the past year, and that she'd been able to spot the leader of the group entering and exiting the town's only church with increasing regularity in recent months. She showed me a picture of a blonde woman with a long pointy nose as proof. When I asked the girl about the person the group was idolizing, the mayor, she started dodging the question. Eventually, all I was able to squeeze out of her was that she was willing to help me with some things, but that there were some things I'd need to find out for myself. I'm a journalist, and I pride myself in never knowing better than to ask questions, so I pressed on until I was unfortunately escorted out of the girl's home by her mother. My partner and I stopped in a diner on our way to the church, a small place called Pa's Vanilla Cafe that looked like it might have been going for an 80s aesthetic, but at some point got overly involved in a dinosaur theme until it eventually lost all sense of cohesion and gained the appearance of a curiosity shop that served pancakes. We ordered the pancakes. At some point, our meal was interrupted by a tall, skinny young man with a great smile. He told us he'd heard about our arrival in town and wanted to be among the first to greet us. We told him we were only there temporarily and that we were actually just investigating a story. His expression twitched slightly, and he asked what we were there to look into. I was starting to get a strange feeling about this man, and I realized that I had no way to tell if he was a part of the cult himself. I answered politely that I wasn't able to give him that information in order to protect the identity of my clients. He laughed and said fair enough, and left us to finish our pancakes. It took us around half an hour, a half hour which I've come to believe was quite critical. As we approached the little church, which looked like it was prepared to collapse under its own weight at any moment, and which had a graveyard that looked like it was plotted out by a 4-year-old scattering gravestones over the plot like they were M&Ms falling out of their hand. We saw that the church grounds were surrounded by police cars and barriers preventing entry. I exited my van and confronted a police officer. "What's happened in this church?" I asked him. And he told me, "Nothing to worry about, we're closing it off." Would it be all right for me to investigate the area? I'm a reporter, I told him. He immediately called over his superiors, who urged me to leave the area and even implied that I should leave the whole town. If you're familiar with my reporting, you should already know that I was not going to leave the town. As we left the scene, I noticed the tall, skinny man from Pa's Vanilla Cafe was getting into a car across the street. He drove away before I had time to question him. My partner and I looked to book a room in the only motel in town, which looked so run down and infested with viable sources of tetanus that I was almost relieved when they told us they had no vacancies. My partner cursed them out, since they advertised that they did in fact have vacancies on their neon sign, and there were no cars in the parking lot to suggest the presence of customers. They just shrugged and waited for us to leave, which we did. We had nowhere to sleep that night except in the van. Don't worry about us, it wasn't the first time we've slept in that van and it won't be the last. We found a nice spot near a forest by a more residential area of town and went to sleep. We awoke to a thudding on the side of our car. It set off the car alarm, and so my partner stumbled into the driver's seat to put the keys in the ignition and try to get it to be quiet, as I struggled to look out the window and see what was making the noise. I saw a figure of someone standing out there. At least it looked like a person. They were wearing what looked like a top hat and they were facing away from us. "There's someone out there," I said, with my voice trembling. "What?" I repeated myself. My partner took a moment to look out the window. "Does it look like they have a weapon?" he asked. I couldn't tell, and he couldn't either. We decided the best thing to do would be to roll down the window and ask what they wanted. So we did. We waited for a response and heard only the night air for some of the scariest 30 seconds of my life. Then, we heard something like a woman's voice shouting towards the sky, "Save us from ourselves!" My partner looked to me, but I had no idea what to do. We decided to drive away, but just as we started, I looked out the window and saw the person turn around. It was blonde, with a pointy nose and almost the spitting image of the cult leader, except it looked like she had the sagging eye sockets of an 80-year-old woman. She waved at me as we drove away, out of True. I waved back. The next morning, I received a phone call from my informant with the cat. She told me the cult leader had apparently been declared dead from a heart attack the day before. I didn't tell her anything about our encounter from the previous night, and how we'd seen the person she was telling me had died. And then, the girl told me that I shouldn't return to True, and that there was nothing left for me to investigate. Well, if you're familiar with my reporting, then you should know that I fully intend to.